So I want to illustrate the use of JSON, JavaScript object notation, by creating an example where we're going to create a JSON file using PHP and we're going to consume that file using JavaScript. So the first thing you need to do when you want to create a JSON page with PHP is you've got to set up your PHP page. And I'm going to actually set my header at the top of my page to indicate that this page is returning text/JavaScript. So this is actually going to be a JavaScript file because JSON is actually JavaScript. And then I'm going to require my database connection object just so I can connect to my database and get the data for my JSON object. And then I'm also going to require at the bottom of my file a close.inc file, so I close my database connection. So when I'm creating my JSON file, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to create a variable that's going to contain all of my data. That I read from the database, my JSON data. And then I'm going to run a query on my database. And that query is going to be just a standard query. I'm going to select star from my item table, and then I'm going to run that query against my database using the connection object, which is the object that I create to connect to the database in my ddb.inc file. Finally, I'm just going to create a dummy variable called rows, which is going to contain all of the rows that are returned from my database query. So this query should return multiple rows, and so I'm going to do that. So then I'm going to want to loop through all of my data, and so I'm going to go while row, so I'm going to get one row equals fetch assoc, so I'm going to fetch an associative array, and then I'm going to push the row onto my rows array. So essentially I'm going to have an array of arrays. So the inner array is going to be all of the data, each row from the database, and then the outer array is going to contain all of the rows. So I'm going to go through, once I've got all my data, then I actually have to create my JSON file. In PHP, the way you create a JSON data is you actually are going to go and you're going to use the JSON encode method. And so I'm going to just set my output variable, and I'm going to use JSON encode to encode this rows as an array. And just to test this out and see what it outputs, I'm just going to echo I need my $sign. And so this should give me my basic file. So I'm going to save my JSON file, and then you can see what that will look like when I run it on my server. So let me run it on my local server. So this is my write. JSON.php is the name of my file. When I run this, this is going to create a JSON data set. It's fairly large because I've got 5 rows in my table, but it's returning the item ID, which is the name of my column, the item category ID, the item name, the item description, the item image, and an item thumbnail, which is a small image. So that's all of the data associated with one item right here. This is my second item. This is my third item. This is my fourth item. And so I have an array of items, and you can tell it's an array because it's inside these square braces. So now there's one other thing I'd like to do. This will work just fine if I were to then get this data in a JavaScript page using Ajax, and I had this page on the same server as my HTML page that I was doing the request on. But if I want to create this as an API where somebody else from outside my domain could access and get the data from me, Ajax limits you to only getting data from the same domain that you request, you create the data on. It's retrieved from. And so there's something called JSON P. And what JSON P is, it's just a way of wrapping a JSON call inside script tags And so let's go back to my code. And so this is going to output straight JSON, but there's a trick or a workaround to make JSON be able to return JSON data to anybody that wants to request that. And the way you do that is you actually include a callback. So I've got this callback function, and so it says if is set this variable called callback, then I'm going to get whatever the variable name is, and I'm going to echo, instead of just echoing the JSON data, oops, my output I want to have up here. Cut. My output's here. So that's my JSON data, and I either want to echo my data as it stands, just like I did before, or I want to echo this data inside a function call. So what this will do is it's going to echo essentially what will look like a function call. So you're going to call this callback function, and it is going to call this function on your local machine and allow you to output the JSON data. And I'll show you what this looks like on the server, just so you can see what it does. So instead of this, I'm going to refresh this page. Oh, I didn't, and I have to specify a callback function. So I'll do question callback. And this could be any function name that I want to call back, so I'll call it my callback. If I do this, then what I wind up with is essentially a function call that is going to pass the data to something on my current website, in my current page. Now all I have to do is in JavaScript, I actually have to call this function. So now I'm going to create the JavaScript half of this program. So in JavaScript, I'm going to create just a straight HTML page. So to create this HTML page, I'm going to start it out with the normal tags you would start an HTML page with. So I'm going to have an opening script tag and a closing script tag, a closing body tag, and a closing HTML tag. Okay, so now I've got, this is my basic format. What I have to do is whatever callback function I want to call, I'm going to create a function here, and it's just a basic JavaScript function. Something like this. Function my callback data. I'm going to create a variable text, which is the data I'm going to write out. And I'm going to loop through this data, because this data is going to be an array. Each one of the items in my array is a separate item from my database table. So I'm going to go item equals data sub I. And then I'm going to actually write the data to the screen. The nice thing about using JSON data is that the data itself is automatically a JavaScript object. So this is just some HTML. I'm going to output things in. I'm reading this off my local host for the moment, so I'm just going to read the images from the image file. So in order to retrieve the thumbnail image name, I just say, okay, item, which is the variable that I have just, the first item that I'm looping through, and then I just say dot item thumb, which is the, essentially item thumb is one of my data values in my first object. Then I'm going to write out the item ID into a URL and the item name into, so it displays on the screen. So in order to get my data, I actually just have to put in a script tag. And I just do source. If I'm doing this on localhost, I just have to get my localhost URL. So let's go back to my browser, and I'm going to get my URL, and I'm going to come back to my HTML page, and I'm going to paste this in. And I'll just end my script tag. So let me add my closing curly brace for my function. And then I have to, once I have gotten all the data in this text variable, I have to then actually write the text out. And I'm going to actually write this out. I'm writing it to a table, so I'm actually going to write out, let's see, document, get element ID, JSON data, which is the name of my div box. I'm going to actually write the enclosing table tags in that div box, and then I'm going to write the text I just gathered into that table. So let's save that and go see what it looks like in my browser. So I'm going to go like this, and I'm going to reload. And there we go. This is my JSON data processed off of my local server. The nice thing about this is that this will work regardless of whether I test it on my local machine, or I can even go and I can test it on a remote machine, which I've uploaded this to. So I've uploaded it to my distance server. So if I edit my file and I change this URL to this, and I save it, and I reload my local version of the page, it takes a little bit longer because it's going to the remote server, and it returns the same data. This is something that would not work with regular AJAX. It only works with this because we're mimicking including a remote JavaScript file instead of doing a straight AJAX request. So I'm able to get this remote JSON data and use it in my JavaScript application. So that's an example of using JSON with both PHP and JavaScript.